Hello and welcome to CANNAMANtv. My name is Connor MacLeod. In this extremely informative interview, I speak with Strathclyde University Professor and cannabis author, Jim Mills. In this interview, we discuss the relationship cannabis and opium have had on shaping the landscape of international drug policy, UK cannabis drug policy, cannabis policing in the UK, and Professor Mills' new book, Cannabis, Global Histories. Make sure and like and subscribe, and join me on Patreon, where you could help to build a stronger cannabis media platform. Now then, let's talk cannabis. Absolutely delighted to have you on the channel, honestly. I'm aware that we're relatively short on time, so we'll essentially just get cracking. So thank you very much, Professor Mills, for joining me.
No, not at all, Connor. Glad to be here.
So we'll just essentially start off then by, could you describe the cannabis landscape in the UK at the beginning of the 1800s, taking into account the British Empire's influence culturally across the world?
Right, wow, and we've only got 40 minutes.
We do. The thing is, this is the beginning. I was actually looking over these things. I was like, oh man, we'll cover this, but nevertheless.
Yeah, look, I'll happily give you a quick overview. I think what I found out when I first began researching this was, to my surprise, was just how far back the history of cannabis went in Britain. Like most people, I guess, I assume that the story had some murky origins back in the 1960s. But the more I sat in the British Library and began to kind of track all this back as far as I could, I began to work out that actually there were elements of history way back in the 1560s, let alone the 1960s. Because interestingly enough, the Elizabethan government down in England back then were interested in Indian hemp, which is essentially the cannabis plants. But back then I got all excited because I thought I was going to get myself a TV series out of this. I thought, the Elizabethans on cannabis, who's not going to buy a whole TV series on that? But it turned out that they were actually trying to encourage the growth of this for its fibers rather than for its psychoactive substances. And it's really only in the 18th century that British doctors and botanists and those in the scientific circles of the Enlightenment really began to pay any attention to cannabis. And we know this because the sort of late 18th century was a bit of a golden period in terms of dictionaries, medical dictionaries and botanical dictionaries, which tried to capture all the knowledge available at the time about the natural world, about the medical world, and so on, as part of the Enlightenment project. So what we find is that you get references in a number of these encyclopedias, be they botanical or scientific or medical, to cannabis. But it also became quite clear very quickly that these references were based on hearsay, that or they were references to sometimes ancient texts, such as those by people like Dioscorides. And it's really only in the beginning of the 19th century that you begin to find accounts appearing in Britain of cannabis, which are based on first-hand experience. And as you mentioned, I think this has got something to do with empire, because these first-hand experiences were being written up by medical men who were serving in India. And of course, in India, cannabis, which grows abundantly, wild there, but which was also cultivated for medical and recreational purposes, was available in the local marketplaces. It was used by doctors and practitioners in the local medical systems. So individuals like William O'Shaughnessy, who were keen observers of what the locals were using medicinally and recreationally in India, would begin experimenting with a whole range of substances that they encountered in local practices. O'Shaughnessy, of course, is the most famous of these observers, because he wrote up his experiments with cannabis at the end of the 1830s, and news of this began to get back to Britain in the early 1840s. And essentially what O'Shaughnessy writes is very familiar to us today, that local societies would treat cannabis substances with some suspicion sometimes, because they were aware of its psychoactive effects and They were also aware that certain individuals could become, habituated to the use of this powerful plant. But he also recommended it to his fellow doctors back in Britain because he found it to be a useful painkiller. He found it was good as an anticonvulsive in conditions such as rabies. And generally, my idea is he began to see it as a real alternative to opium, which had become the go-to Victorian wonder drug in the first 3 or 4 decades of the 19th century. So I suppose the long answer to your short question is that the first hands-on experience that British scientists had with cannabis and its applications came because of empire, because these Enlightenment doctors, these men who had trained in the big medical centres, particularly in Scotland, in Edinburgh, Aberdeen and Glasgow, were now working in India. And, their training meant that they were curious about the medicinal substances being used there.
The Indian Hemp Drug Commission report of 1894, it seems to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, the largest, the very first cross-cultural analysis of cannabis, of its use. So what was was the UK government's interpretation of the conclusions racially charged? And if so, why was that?
It's an interesting question, Connor. The Indian Hemp Drugs Commission is one of the great curiosities, I think, of the whole history of the empire. It's this enormous set of documents. I think it's 7 volumes. I forget if it's 7 or 8. It was 7 volumes worth of witness testimony taken by the commissioners across 9 months, touring widely around India, talking to not just Westerners, but to Indians themselves, albeit on the whole, elite Indians. You tend to find that very few consumers of the substance themselves were consulted. However, it is a fascinating insight into a cannabis using society, not least of all because of the politics of the commission. The commission was in part a response to the anti-opium campaigns that were an important feature of late Victorian politics. Quite simply, the opium trade between India, where opium was produced, and China, where opium was consumed, was a matter of considerable controversy across the 1860s onwards. And in many ways was a vehicle for much wider anti-imperial politics and the interests of various other groups who were keen to exploit Chinese markets. What you find is this comes to a head in the 1890s, and the British government decide that they're going to try and distract anti-opium campaigners by giving them a commission into cannabis rather than into the opium trade. So you find that even though there was very little knowledge of cannabis in Britain in the 1890s, suddenly this enormous government investigation has been ordered into it. So what you tend to find is that within that 8 volumes, there is all sorts of conflicting evidence and conflicting opinions about whether cannabis causes crime, about whether cannabis causes mental illness, about the effects of cannabis on the economy, and so on. So a number of different issues produces this wide range of, as I say, contradictory and often conflicting material. However, the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission tried to reach quite clear conclusions that cannabis use across society didn't really impact on crime. There was no relationship between cannabis users and criminals. That it only really caused mental illness where cannabis was used to excess as opposed to where cannabis was used in moderation. Although, of course, the Commission didn't define what excessive use was or moderate use was, which has been a criticism of it ever since. But what's interesting about the Commission is that its conclusions were then condemned by 2 members of the Commission itself, who felt that the conclusions didn't really reflect the contradictory nature of the evidence. Were the conclusions racially influenced? I'm not so sure, Connor, but I think that they were certainly influenced by the politics of the period. because the government was quite keen to see the cannabis trade within India given the thumbs up, given the okay. Because the argument amongst the authorities was, well, look, cannabis consumption in the local population is something that was well established before we turned up. It's not something that we've got any chance of effectively prohibiting. And also, we derive a useful revenue from taxing cannabis consumption in the local population, a taxation that we only impose to try and encourage moderate use by inflating the price. You know, it's a very similar logic to that on tobacco taxation these days in the UK. And for that reason, many criticise the Commission as being a whitewash. So I'm not sure that its conclusions were driven by racial considerations, although I think much of the evidence reflects the racial assumptions of the period about India and Indians. However, I think there was certainly an element of imperial politicking behind the conclusions of the Commission, which incidentally were quickly forgotten, because the year after the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission was ordered, the government in the UK had to finally cave in and give the anti-opium campaigners the Royal Opium Commission of 1895. So for all the work and all the material and some of the controversial conclusions drawn about cannabis in the IHDC, it was quickly forgotten.
So, I mean, inevitably, like 30 years later, we have the 1928, where there's obviously the restriction on cannabis. I mean, what was the steps that led to that? Because as you mentioned there, the Indian Hemp report, the results seem to be, although conflicting, relatively the negative impacts of cannabis use on the culture of India seem to be relatively negligible. So what would have then led to the 30 years later a prohibited stance through the UK?
Well, you know, it's the very simple answer is empire again. And the increasingly tangled politics of Britain's empire, you know, really in international relations. Because in 1928, Britain gets its first controls imposed on cannabis, despite the fact that there's very little cannabis consumption in Britain at the time. And this is if you like, an interesting phenomenon that I've called control before consumption.
Right.
It's unusual in the history of drugs policy for laws to be imposed or regulations to be imposed on the consumption of a particular substance before anybody in that country is consuming that substance. But the reason for this lies in the imperial politics of the preceding 2 decades or so. Because what you find is that the US government, for complex reasons, adopts a anti-opium stance in its own Asian colonies. So in the Philippines, it tries to pursue this radical anti-opium policy. But of course, it finds out that it's very difficult to stop a population from consuming a substance that it was used to consuming. And particularly what you end up doing, of course, is you ramp up the price, which increases the amount of suppliers willing to run the risk of trafficking the substance. So the Americans decided, right, this issue demands international cooperation. So from 1908 onwards, the Americans have been driving an agenda of where the nations involved in opium trading in Asia came together on a regular basis to try and work out ways of reducing demand and reducing supply. The outcome of this, of course, was the League of Nations Opium Office. The Opium Office was a central part of the post-war League of Nations that came about in 1919. And the Americans were determined to dominate this, even though they weren't members of the League of Nations, in order to drive through this prohibitionist opium policy. Now, the British knew fine well that they couldn't stop opium consumption in Asia, although they had been reducing opium production ever since 1906 for export to China. But they knew fine well that in India, opium was used for medicinal reasons, And in certain parts of the country, it was also used for recreational reasons. So there was no appetite on the part of the British government in India to reduce opium consumption. However, the British administration in Egypt, ever since the 1890s, had decided that it would try to prohibit the consumption of certain substances. The key substance, the key psychoactive substance used in Egypt is hashish, of course, cannabis. So you find that the politics of empire start to get tangled up here, because suddenly at the League of Nations, you've got a British colonial administration in India saying, no, look, there's no point trying to prohibit the consumption of these substances. It will be an enormous use of resources. It will cause lots of resentment in the local population, and it will achieve nothing. But then on the other side, you've got a British colonial administration representing Egypt at the League of Nations saying, oh, prohibition is really important. And we've enjoyed moderate success. And the key to increasing that level of success is international cooperation. So you find that you've got these two administrations with very different attitudes, even though both are British imperial governments. The big meeting happens in 1924, at the end of 1924, where the American government is trying to force through these radical anti-opium proposals. And the British government is determined to stop them. The Egyptian delegation turns up, but this is the first time that the Egyptian delegation was Egyptian, because Britain had recently stepped back from its interference in Egyptian affairs, right. Now allowed Egyptians a much greater degree of domestic power. So there were many more Egyptians involved in the government of the country. So the delegation who turn up to talk about drugs matters are all Egyptians, and they take great pleasure in pointing out that the British administration had failed in its effort to control these dangerous substances in Egypt. And it's a good job that we Egyptians are now in charge. We're going to sort this out properly. And this enormously impressed the delegation, the whole conference, who, especially on the American side, were very anti-imperial. So the Egyptians turned around and said, well, yes, opium is a terrible problem, but in our country, the real problem is cannabis. So suddenly you found cannabis was thrust into this set of international relations regarding opium. And because the Americans were looking for allies to try and drive through their anti-opium agenda, they sided firmly with the Egyptians on their anti-cannabis agenda, which meant that now the British government in India found themselves backed into a corner. Right. So eventually they had to agree to a watered down set of proposals on opium and also on cannabis. Yeah. So in 1925, Britain ratifies the agreement that finally comes out of the League of Nations, which means that 3 years later, Britain is forced to, if you like, put into practice this set of agreements, which means that in domestic law, for the first time, it has a set of controls on cannabis, even though it was the British representatives at that meeting in 1925 who had opposed those controls and regulations.
Do you know what's quite interesting about this is that how much current day legislation of cannabis is integrated obviously into obviously drug policy, and it seems to be it's always been that way, that the conflict seems to be integrated, and even like obviously 100 years ago it seems to be relatively explicit that it's almost like collateral damage.
I mean, you couldn't be more right, and I think that the it's only over the last 4 or 5 years, at the the level of the United Nations and the international relations regarding cannabis. It's only in the last 4 or 5 years that the message has finally got through that cannabis has been tangled up in opium politics over the century now, and that's the reason why cannabis is often scheduled alongside powerful opium substances and powerful opiates and opioids, not because it it makes sense, scientific sense or sociological sense to put cannabis alongside these substances. The reason it's there is purely historical, that cannabis products got tangled up with the opium politics of the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
So if we were to fast forward to the 1960s, then you've got an article that IHO has acted the case of cannabis in the Single Convention on Narcotics, Drugs, 1961. So what were the main conclusions that you drew from this article? And personally, how do you feel that it's that essentially governments are the only ones that are able to hold licenses based on cannabis production?
Yeah, I set out in that article to try and answer the question, which I touched on in one of the books, Cannabis Nation, of, well, how did attitudes towards cannabis change at the international level? Because in 1952, the World Health Organization, which had only really been in existence since 1945, suddenly came out with this very clear declaration that cannabis was now obsolete as a source of medicines, which was a very clear statement that really dominated attitudes in scientific and medical circles towards the cannabis plant for the next 40 years, or even half a century. And talking to scientists like Roger Pertwee, who was at Aberdeen, who was very much a pioneer of cannabis research in Britain during the 80s and the 90s, he'll tell you that it was virtually impossible to get a license from the Home Office to actually handle cannabis in a laboratory context, because there was simply no interest or no backing for research into cannabis medicines. So I trace this back to this 1952 declaration. If you go back further, you find that the WHO's predecessors in the League of Nations were a subcommittee on cannabis. And they spent 10 years in the 1930s gathering evidence from around the world on cannabis and simply could not come to any agreed position amongst themselves on whether cannabis caused social harms, whether it caused harms in mental health, whether it was a source of useful medicines, whether it had other scientific applications. Because, of course, we all know cannabis is a complex substance, and it has many potential uses that can be beneficial, but in certain contexts, But rather than say this, by the end of the 1930s, this cannabis subcommittee kind of just reached to a point where it could not summarize this. It had so much evidence from around the world and so many different experts involved that there were no clear recommendations. Fast forward to the WHO, and you can argue that the WHO group that was brought hastily together to come up with a definitive position on cannabis was carefully selected in order to reach that conclusion. It included people like R.N. Chopra, who was a leading Indian scientist who built his career on studying addiction in India. And was absolutely convinced that cannabis users in India could safely be called addicts, even though the term was very slippery at the time. This was a headline. There's X number of million cannabis addicts in India. Addict being the alarm word of the 1950s. The same with a guy called Pablo Osvaldo Wolf, who was if I remember right, it was the Argentinian delegate. But most of his publications on cannabis were based on newspaper reports from back in Latin America, which of course were highly sensationalist, but also fitted the standard model. A lone cannabis user who become crazed with his cannabis use and had shot the police or murdered the locals and so on. So this was far from what we would now consider to be safe scientific evidence. This expert panel, I've argued, was very carefully pulled together to kind of cut through all the dithering of the 1930s and to reach a very clear point, which was that cannabis was obsolete as a source of medicines and carried with it social and health harms. So what you find is that the WHO conclusion then enables the United Nations, which were trying to bring together all the drugs treaties of the previous 4 decades, into what became the 1961 Single Convention, it helped it to reach a position on cannabis. So what you find is, and what I argue in that particular article, is that the Secretariat at the United Nations, who were behind trying to drive this process of bringing all these nations together, to bring all these treaties together and to consolidate them into one international agreement, this Secretariat was very focused. So when you go through the endless meetings of these committees for the whole of the 1950s, what you find is lots and lots of evidence starts to arrive. So they send a questionnaire around the world, all the member states. And of course, much like the 1930s, everybody sends in lots and lots of material, much of which is contradictory or complex, doesn't lend itself to an easy conclusion. What you find when you read the document that the Secretariat presents back to committee members and ultimately to the United Nations itself, all the contradictory evidence has been thinned out. And much of the evidence that you can find in the national documents, the evidence that finds its way into their kind of recommendation, their advice document, is overwhelmingly negative. And this is my argument that, here you've now got a bureaucracy at the United Nations whose job it is to paint drugs consumption in as dark a way as possible. And they're doing this for two reasons. First of all, because they want to get the job done. Mm-hmm. Their job is to get everybody to agree that all these substances need to be controlled, and controlled in the same way in every single country. So of course they're going to focus on the negative. They're going to try and block out the contradictory and the complex evidence as, well, that's noise. Let's get a focus here. Mm-hmm. Of course, if you were to be cynical, you could argue that these bureaucrats would be out of a job if there was no drugs problem, or if they discovered that the drugs problem had been greatly exaggerated. So, if one was to be cynical, one would certainly reach the conclusion that the world's drugs problems at the end of the 1930s were very similar by the end of the 1950s. The difference was that you now had a bureaucracy driving a very simple position on this. And perhaps that remains the case to this day.
It's really frustrating how much it seems to be that it's the manipulation of narrative towards drug policy that's, and instead of the actual legitimate investigation of the impact they have. So before we actually move forward into your book, if it's getting launched next week,
Connor, if I might just, it's very interesting because you're absolutely right. But I think that when you look back at the history of the way that this has panned out in Britain in particular, that's probably true of all sides in the argument. Yeah. Because you can argue that, the evidence has been simplified on the regulation side. But, having our chat today prompted me to actually go back and read some of my own stuff. Yeah. Because it's been 10 years now since Cannabis Nation came out. And it's remarkable what you forget you've discovered. Yeah. I was reading the material on the 1990s again. And the whole story of how the momentum began to build from about 1997 through to 2002, I think it was, on the side of the reclassification or the legalization mob. Yeah. And what's interesting is, of course, that the evidence selected, by the Independent on Sunday famously got involved on we need legalization, or at the very least we need reclassification. And this prompted, Howard Marks, this is when he enjoyed his moment in the limelight as a sort of celebrity drug smuggler, and various new groups sprang up. And I touched on a chap whose name at the time was Free Rob Cannabis. And his role in trying to, set up new organizations. And he got involved in the legalized cannabis campaign. What you actually look at is, of course, that on the side of those who are challenging legalization and prohibition and so on, their evidence is just as again. And you'll often find also that there's significant disagreement amongst themselves. And this is part of the reason, I think, why moves towards deregulation or legalization often fall to bits. Because the evidence is so contradictory, and the motives behind those who get involved in these movements and these organizations are often so opposed that you find yourself in mind of the history of the other side, those who have pressed regulation and so on, that there are moments when people try and squeeze all the noise out to concentrate on a very clear and concise argument. Probably the moment when everything then starts to unravel again.
I think that's almost touching on a conversation about true objectivity, really. I mean, it's that thing where it's like, but I do think I fully agree. One of the things, I mean, I'll probably get a lot of negative backlash for this next statement, but I'm actually in the process of writing a book called Getting Out of the Weeds, a seasoned consumer's guide to essentially removing cannabis from your life, or at least if it's having a negative impact. Because I think one of the things that's very often disregarded in the cannabis world is that it has negative impacts on some people's health and some people's ability to function on a daily basis. And I think it is counterintuitive to anybody that's looking for a legitimate objective perspective of the harm that's caused through that. So 100%, I find it relatively humanist. I don't know if it's just the human tendency for tribalism that's just like, this is my team and this is where we are,
But I would go back to the point I think I touched on earlier as well, because I couldn't agree with you more, Connor, that, cannabis is a complex substance. Roger Pertwee, who I mentioned earlier, he devoted most of his career to quietly researching cannabis. And I do him a disservice, but I think he's a pharmacologist. And I remember having a chat with Roger probably 10, 15 years ago when I was researching this book, and he said, as a pharmacologist who devoted his career to quietly researching cannabis, he'd managed to identify about 100 different chemicals in the substance, but still wasn't finished. And that's an incredibly complex plant. And of course, the way it works on the human body is incredibly complex. And of course, each one of us likes to think of ourselves as slightly different from everybody else. So the way that each, this plant, but of course then what you really mean by this plant is these plants. Because if you get if you're handling organic cannabis and you're making your own products from it, well, it depends if it was at the top of the hill or the bottom of the hill, if it was in full sunshine or in part sunshine. It depends if it was near the window, if you're growing it at home, or if it was too close to the shed where the slugs are, if you're growing it in the garden. This is a very complex set of interactions between human bodies and a very complicated organic substance. And what you find is that what you've just said there, British observers were writing down 200 years ago in India that on the whole, most people who use these substances use them moderately. They use them for partly medicinal reasons and partly recreational reasons. Never seem to, use them too often or too much. But there are people who use them too often and too much. They seem to do little else but use these substances all day. They're not capable of maintaining relationships. They're not capable of working, and so on. So I don't think we should be surprised that we're both sat here saying, well, look, this can cause harms as well as have benefits, because observers of cannabis using societies have been saying this for 200 years and quite possibly for 2,000 years.
But if I was to just even before we move forward, then this is if I was to ask you to just generally summarise in one overall statement UK's prohibition of cannabis, what would that be?
Well, I think it's ever changing, Connor. So I think what's been interesting about looking at this backwards is to realise the way in which, we've got very similar cannabis laws to those that we had, certainly in from 1962 onwards, I think it was. Which have their basis on the 1928 regulations and so on. But I think that the key to understanding the way in which cannabis has been, cannabis laws work, is back to this idea I used in Cannabis Nation of the British Compromise. So essentially, politicians found out that trying to come up with evidence-based cannabis policy in law was impossible. by the end of the 1960s, and the Wootton Committee. So I think what I've discovered is that what they did was they've outsourced big questions like, well, how much cannabis should be considered as possession for personal use? How much is possession for supply? What is intent to supply? And so on. So what they did was in the 1970s, because this issue had proved so divisive, a conservative administration actually decided we're not going near that again in law. What we're going to do is we're going to tell magistrates to use their common sense. So in other words, we don't need to be sending someone off to jail for 15 years for having, a couple of ounces of cannabis on them. We're not going to say that, though, because that would undermine the law. What we're going to do is we're going to advise magistrates to impose sentences that reflect common sense. But then the magistrates discovered across the 1970s they didn't want to get tangled up in this. So they then passed this on to the police. And that's how we've got to where we are now. So for the last 30 years, cannabis law has actually been in the hands of the police and the policeman or the police officer on the spot, who has to make these decisions that Parliament couldn't back in the 1960s. Is this individual who's carrying cannabis, are they carrying it for personal use? In which case you'll get a smack on the wrist. Are they carrying it with intent to supply? Or how much is intent to supply? That's now based entirely on the police officer's judgment and experience. So if you really want to understand how British laws on cannabis work now, don't go back and look at the history of the law on cannabis. Go back and have a look at the history of how cannabis has been policed, because it is police officers who are deciding every day what the law on cannabis is.
I think this is where one of the conflicts come in then, because very often you're dealing with a regional element where they're requiring a certain amount of arrests in order to maintain a certain potentially quota, let's say. And I think very often there could be, let's be honest, the social prejudice based in the demographics, so forth, things like that have obviously been really explicit, that show the numbers of individuals that are incarcerated are disproportionate across the spectrum of ethnicity, really, which is something, again, that I think these are all arguments in favour of decriminalisation, which is taking away the health element,
Well, you're absolutely right. And of course, the history of cannabis policing in this country is entirely tied up with the history of stop and search powers in this country. And you'll find that, back in the 1970s, this is why the police were quite happy to find themselves in a position where they were deciding what amount of cannabis constituted a threat to public order, because this allowed them to interfere in cannabis consuming communities, which at the time, were tied up with issues of race and immigration and so on. Fast forward to the present day, and you find that's exactly the same, that, there is a disproportionate number of stop and searches based on the idea that a drugs crime is about to be committed on Afro-Caribbean, communities of Afro-Caribbean descent. Mm-hmm. So there are these remarkable continuities. So, it does give you a sense that there are unintended outcomes when you leave these complex decisions in the hands of police officers, because, of course, they will have a number of agendas that they are pursuing, some of which are often entirely unrelated to drugs consumption. And I should point out as well that when David Blunkett tried to push through a set of reclassification issues back in the early noughties, it was police officers who stepped in, senior police officers, to try and dissuade him from doing this, because they understood how important their stop and search powers were.
So your book next week then, Professor Mills, Cannabis, Global Histories, it's obviously being launched here. You have a talk on the 6th of October, which is, I'll leave the link in the description box below for anybody that'd like to join into that. So what should we expect from that book, and what was your motivation for writing it?
Well, yeah, thanks for mentioning it, Connor. And it was interesting, just as we were having that discussion there about policing, I think one of the things that this book brings out is that this isn't an entirely British story, that you get the use of drugs laws being driven by complex agendas by police officers all around the world. So this is a similar story in the US, as you would expect, but we find similar stories in Asia and in Latin America, where drugs laws, and in particular cannabis powers, enable the policing of certain communities. So social anxieties and, anxieties within certain police forces about certain groups or certain populations find their outlet in cannabis laws. So if you want to be interfering in a particular community, the police will use general drugs laws, or in particular anxieties about cannabis, to interfere in those communities. So the story we've just been discussing there isn't an entirely British one. It has echoes in comparisons elsewhere, which of course is why Luke and I decided that we were going to have the conference back in 2016, and why we produced a set of the papers from that event, which has just been published with the title Cannabis Global Histories, because Luke works on the US context, I was working on the UK context. And then we began to notice that there was more and more research happening in national contexts. So James Bradford was working on Afghanistan, and let me have a think, Neil and Gernot were working on different African contexts. People like Alina Brito were working in South America, and so on. So we thought, well, what happens if you bring all these people together? Because the dominant paradigm at the time was looking at the national story. What happens in Britain, what happens in Colombia, what happens in the US, what happens in Afghanistan, what happens in Germany, and so on. We had the idea of finding out what happened when you brought these national experts together and then tried to think above the national context. So I think the conclusion that we're edging towards by trying to look at, at this on a national, above a national basis, is that actually, you seem to have a transnational phenomenon here, which is cannabis communities, cannabis consumers moving around the world and establishing themselves as new markets, and then suppliers following them. So you find that the history of the last 2 centuries, as far as cannabis is concerned, in part it's about imperialism, in part it's about migration, it's about capitalism moving cannabis using societies into new places. The most obvious example in Britain is the arrival of migrants from around the empire in the 1950s, who then settled down here and became markets for cannabis. But then, of course, the communities and societies around them begin to get interested in what drugs they've got, what food they've got, what music they're listening to, and so on. What happens then is governments try to deal with that, but on a national basis, discover that the tools available to a nation state are inadequate for dealing with what is a transnational problem. And they've ended up trying to use international solutions to this through bodies like the World Health Organization and the United Nations. So what I think we'll be discussing next week is this idea that we began to move towards in the introduction to the book, which is maybe this begins to explain why regulation and prohibition has proven to be so difficult, because you've got this slippage between a transnational problem, the limitations of nation states, and perhaps what we've been discovering over the last 5 or 6 years with cannabis is also the failures of international bodies to be able to help nation states or to deal with transnational problems. And in saying that, and then looking at the fate of the WHO over the last year with COVID, maybe this is something that doesn't just apply to cannabis.
Yeah. But just before we go in, Professor Mills, one of the things obviously that we've predominantly focused on is the sociological elements of cannabis. But one of the things that I find most explicit is the negative environmental impacts as a result of these prohibition elements.
Absolutely. And I think that and I think this is what we've also found in trying to think about global histories of cannabis, that there are lots of local stories. So it's all very well to try and write a tangled narrative. But what we also find is that there are very local stories that mustn't get lost in trying to take a big picture approach. And I think what you're referring to there is this particular history of cannabis production in various parts of the world, where this has had all sorts of unintended consequences. Yes. So yes, there are environmental and ecological problems in places which have become major producers of cannabis for global markets. But there's all sorts of other intended consequences. Lena Brito's work on Colombia, which Lena, in the end, couldn't participate in this project, but it always sticks in my mind, her work, because she showed how, we all associate Colombia with cocaine in the 80s and the 90s, cocaine production and export. But it was actually cannabis production back in the 1970s, which gave Colombian growers the idea of looking for international markets, because they began to sell cannabis that grew freely into the American market. And this set up the routes for cocaine that was to follow in the 1980s and the 1990s. So again, I think that, when we begin to think about the impacts of a globalizing cannabis trade, we need to look at the negatives as well as the positives.
Thanks to Professor Mills for giving me his time, and thanks to you for sticking around until the end of the video. I sincerely hope you enjoyed the content. I'll see you next time.